The first thing my father said that night wasn't hello. It wasn't how have you been, or you look tired, or even thank you for driving 3 hours after a 12-day assignment at Fort Bragg. He waited until the steaks hit the table, until the bourbon was poured, until my brother stopped pretending to smile. Then Dad folded his thick hands over his stomach, looked directly at me and said, "Your brother owes $330,000. You're paying it." I honestly thought I'd misheard him. Jason stared at his plate. His wife Melissa dabbed at dry eyes with a napkin. And my father, the same man who once told me weakness disgusted him, leaned back in his chair like he was discussing the weather. "Refuse," he said calmly, "and you're no longer family." That was the moment something inside me finally went still. Not broken. Still. Because after 48 years of trying to earn love that always came with conditions, I suddenly realized I was free to stop trying. And 5 days later, when they showed up at my front door demanding answers, they found out exactly what that freedom cost them. I grew up believing silence was the price of belonging. My father raised us in a narrow white farmhouse outside Roanoke, Virginia, where every room smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, motor oil, and whatever resentment happened to be floating through the walls that week. My mother softened the edges when she could, but after she died 12 years ago, the house became entirely his. Hard, controlled, quiet in all the wrong ways. Jason was 3 years older than me, handsome in the careless way some men are born handsome. Even at 52, he still carried himself like life owed him applause. Growing up, he could crash a truck into a ditch, and Dad would say boys make mistakes. I forgot to pick up dry cleaning once when I was 16, and Dad didn't speak to me for 3 days. By the time I was 18, I understood 2 things very clearly. Jason would always be forgiven. And I would always be useful. The Army saved me from becoming bitter enough to drown in it. I enlisted young, stayed disciplined, and built a life brick by brick. 26 years later, I'd become a logistics officer with enough commendations to fill a wall and enough insomnia to fill another. I owned a quiet cedar-sided house outside Alexandria. I invested carefully. I lived below my means. I trusted almost nobody. Especially after my divorce. Especially after learning how quickly people turn your competence into obligation. Still, I kept showing up for family dinners. That was my mistake. The Carter family barbecue happened every first Sunday of the month at Dad's house. Same warped wooden deck, same cheap folding chairs, same old country music drifting from the garage radio. I almost didn't go that evening. I'd spent the previous week overseeing a military transport exercise and had slept maybe 10 hours total. But Dad had called twice. Family matters, he'd said. So I drove down anyway. The air smelled like charcoal and cut grass when I arrived. Jason's black SUV sat crooked in the driveway beside Melissa's Lexus. I noticed immediately that Jason avoided eye contact when I stepped onto the deck. That should have warned me. Melissa hugged me too tightly. "Evelyn, you look amazing. Seriously, what's your secret?" Distraction, I thought. But I smiled politely. Dad stood at the grill wearing the same stained apron he'd owned for 20 years. "You're late." "It's good to see you too. That Army's still working you like a dog." "Pays better than excuses," I answered. Jason snorted into his beer, but his smile looked strained. Dinner started normally enough. Steaks, potato salad, Melissa talking about kitchen renovations they suddenly couldn't afford. Dad complaining about taxes, Jason drinking too fast. Then came the silence. The kind that feels rehearsed. Dad cut into his steak before speaking. "Jason's in a little trouble." I set down my fork. "What kind of trouble?" Jason rubbed his jaw. "Business setback." Melissa whispered, "It's been really hard." Dad took a sip of bourbon. $330,000. I blinked once. "Excuse me." "He owes money," Dad repeated impatiently. "You've got savings, retirement accounts, investments. You can handle it." I looked at Jason. "How do you lose $330,000? His eyes hardened instantly. "None of your damn business." There it was. The Carter family rulebook. They could demand anything from me, but I wasn't allowed to ask questions. I leaned back slowly in my chair. "You want me to hand over almost $500,000 without explanations?" Dad slammed his glass down. "Don't exaggerate. It's literally $330,000. Family helps family." I laughed once under my breath because the hypocrisy almost impressed me. When Mom got sick, I paid hospital bills while Jason figured things out. When Dad needed roof repairs, I wired money. When Jason lost his first business at 41, I co-signed a loan I never should have touched. Not one of those people at the table had ever asked what any of it cost me. Emotionally, financially, personally. Dad pointed his fork toward me. Your brother's under pressure. Men have pride. I stared at him. And what do women have? He ignored the question. Melissa suddenly spoke up, her voice trembling just enough to sound practiced. If we lose the house. Jason snapped Melissa. No, she insisted. She deserves to know. I noticed then how carefully they were performing desperation, like they'd discussed the script beforehand. Dad leaned forward. You've always been the dependable one, Evelyn. That's what families are for. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. Not anger. Recognition. Because for the first time I saw the truth clearly enough that I couldn't unsee it anymore. Dependable wasn't a compliment in this family. It was a sentence. I looked around the table slowly. At my father's expectation, Jason's entitlement, Melissa's manipulation. None of them looked ashamed. None of them even looked uncertain. They truly believed I would surrender my life savings because they demanded it. And if I refused? I already knew the answer before Dad said it. Refuse, he told me quietly, and you're no longer family. The cicadas buzzed loudly in the trees behind the house. Somewhere down the road a dog barked. Jason finally looked at me then like he was waiting for me to break, waiting for guilt to do what it had always done before. But something strange happened instead. I thought about every military funeral I'd attended. Every soldier who died protecting people they loved. Every exhausted young private who still managed to show more loyalty than my own blood ever had. And suddenly sitting at that table I realized I was more respected by strangers than by the people who shared my last name. I stood slowly. Dad frowned. Sit down. No. You're being emotional. I almost smiled at that. Men like my father always call women emotional the moment they stop obeying. Jason pushed back his chair. Don't make this dramatic. Dramatic, I repeated softly. You're demanding $330,000. Dad's jaw tightened. We're asking you to do the right thing. I picked up my car keys. Then I looked directly at both of them. At some point I said quietly, you have to stop confusing love with access. Dad stood abruptly. You walk out that door, don't bother coming back. For years, those words would have terrified me. That night they felt like oxygen. I met his eyes steadily. Then I'm not family anymore. And before any of them could respond, I walked off the deck, crossed the yard, and got into my car. Behind me, Dad shouted something angry I didn't bother hearing. I drove for nearly 10 minutes before pulling onto the shoulder of a dark rural road lined with pine trees. My hands shook once against the steering wheel. Then they steadied. I opened my phone. The first call went to my bank. I need to freeze all family-authorized access immediately, I said. The second call went to my attorney. Daniel, I told him, staring into the dark Virginia woods, I need every old authorization tied to my family reviewed tonight. There was a pause. Then he asked quietly what happened. I watched my reflection faintly in the windshield. And for the first time in years, I answered honestly. I finally said no. When you spend most of your adult life in the military, you learn that danger rarely arrives screaming. Usually it enters quietly, a missing signature, an unanswered phone call, a line item that doesn't belong where it should. That was what frightened me most the morning after the barbecue. Not my father's threats, not Jason's anger. It was the possibility that they'd already planned for my refusal. I barely slept that night. Around 4 a.m, I gave up pretending and walked barefoot through my dark kitchen, the hardwood cool beneath my feet. My house sat on 3 wooded acres outside Alexandria, quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant rush of interstate traffic. Safe. At least it used to feel safe. Now every shadow in the room felt like unfinished business. I made coffee the way I always did, black strong, no sugar, and stood at the kitchen counter watching rain slide down the windows. My phone buzzed twice before sunrise. Dad. Then Jason. I ignored both. At 6:13 a.m., my attorney called. Evelyn, Daniel said carefully, I think you need to come into the office. His tone tightened something in my chest immediately. "What did you find?" A pause. More than I expected. By 8:30 I was sitting across from him in his Georgetown office while traffic crawled outside beneath a gray sky. Daniel Foster had represented me for nearly 15 years. Former Navy JAG. Methodical. Calm under pressure. The kind of man who only sounded worried when there was reason to be. He slid a folder across the desk. "Do you remember the loan documents you signed for Jason back in 2016? Unfortunately, yes. Jason's construction company had collapsed after a series of terrible investments. Dad begged me to help just temporarily. I'd resisted for weeks before finally agreeing to co-sign a restructuring loan under strict conditions. Jason promised he'd never ask for help again. Men like my brother always say never when they mean until next time." "I remember," I said. Daniel adjusted his glasses. There were additional authorizations attached to the restructuring agreement. "I revoked those years ago. You revoked some." My stomach tightened. He turned the paperwork toward me and tapped several highlighted sections. Buried inside the original financial package were old family trust provisions tied to property inheritance from my mother's estate. Technical, easy to miss, dangerous in the wrong hands. Jason hadn't forged anything, which somehow made it worse. He leveraged the old trust language as collateral representation, Daniel explained. If his creditors push aggressively enough, they may attempt to argue implied financial linkage. I stared at him. "Can they touch my accounts?" "Not directly." But if they create enough legal pressure, this becomes expensive very quickly." I leaned back slowly. The room suddenly felt colder, so the dinner wasn't really a request. Daniel met my eyes. "No." I think it was an ultimatum because they knew the clock was running out. For a moment, all I could hear was the rain against the office windows. My father knew. That realization settled into me like lead. He hadn't invited me to dinner hoping for help. He invited me because they were cornered, and instead of warning me honestly, they tried intimidation first. I let out one slow breath. "Okay," I said calmly. "What do we do?" That was the part I understood. Action, movement, containment. Daniel opened another folder. "We isolate everything immediately." For the next 6 hours, I moved through my life like a controlled demolition expert. Every vulnerable connection had to go. By noon, I was on a conference call with banking compliance officers revoking dormant authorizations and freezing legacy access permissions tied to old family agreements. By 2, my financial advisor initiated the transfer of my late mother's vacation cabin into an irrevocable trust Jason couldn't leverage. At 3:15, I authorized changes to my estate structure insurance beneficiaries and property documentation. Military life teaches you to compartmentalize emotions until the mission is complete. So I did. I signed forms, verified passwords, updated security protocols, changed gate codes, canceled emergency access permissions. Each signature felt less like panic and more like surgery without anesthesia. Necessary, painful, final. At 4:30, while I sat in my car outside the bank, my phone buzzed again. "Jason." This time I answered. "What?" His breathing sounded uneven. "Did you freeze the accounts? The accounts were never yours. Don't do this." I almost laughed. "Don't do this." As if I were the one who created the disaster. "You tried to attach me to your debt without my consent." "That's not what happened." "Really?" Silence. Then his voice sharpened. "You have any idea what kind of pressure I'm under?" I looked through my windshield at people hurrying along the sidewalk in expensive coats, carrying coffees and briefcases and ordinary problems. "I spent 26 years deploying soldiers into war zones," I said quietly. "Trust me. I understand pressure. Dad said you'd overreact." There it was again. Not concern. Management. They weren't trying to fix the betrayal. They were trying to regain control of me. "I'm done discussing this." "Evelyn," I hung up. 10 seconds later, Melissa texted, "You're destroying this family." I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone face down on the passenger seat. No. The family had been breaking for years. I was just the first one refusing to pretend otherwise. That evening, I stopped at my house only long enough to change clothes before driving to the private security company that monitored my property. The technician, a former Marine named Ortiz, reviewed upgraded surveillance options while I signed paperwork. "You expecting trouble?" he asked casually. I thought about my father standing over a grill demanding $330,000 like he was collecting rent. "Yes," I answered honestly. "Possibly." By the time I returned home, the rain had stopped. The woods behind my house glistened silver under moonlight branches swaying softly in the wind. Inside, the silence felt different now. Not lonely. Protected. I poured myself a glass of water and finally checked my voicemail. Dad had left 4 messages. The first sounded irritated. The second sounded angry. By the 4th, his voice had hardened into something uglier. "You're embarrassing this family," he snapped. "Call me back before this gets worse. Before this gets worse." As if he still thought he was negotiating from a position of power. I deleted every message without responding. Then sometime after midnight, while searching through old files in my study for additional trust paperwork, I found a small cedar box I hadn't opened in years. My mother's handwriting curved softly across the lid. For Evelyn. My chest tightened instantly. I carried the box into the living room and sat on the floor beside the coffee table, the lamp casting warm light over faded photographs, old recipes, birthday cards, tiny fragments of a woman who spent her entire life trying to keep peace between impossible people. At the bottom sat an envelope, unopened. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the letter inside. Evelyn. If you're reading this, then I probably waited too long to say certain things out loud. Your father loves in ways that often feel like ownership. Jason loves in ways that require rescuing. And you learned so early how to survive without asking for anything that everyone mistook your strength for permission. Please don't let them confuse sacrifice with love. And if they ever force you to buy your place in this family, leave. Love should never send invoices. I stopped reading. For several seconds, I just sat there staring at the paper while tears blurred the ink. Not dramatic tears. Not loud ones. The quiet kind that arrive when a truth reaches you years too late. My mother knew. Maybe she'd always known. Outside wind rustled through the trees. Inside, something old and exhausted finally loosened its grip on my chest. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it against my palm. Then the security alert chimed through the house at exactly 6:12 the next morning. Motion detected front driveway. I looked at the monitor beside my kitchen. Dad stood at the gate. Jason beside him. Melissa in the background with crossed arms and sunglasses hiding her eyes. They weren't visiting. They were coming to reclaim something they still believed belonged to them. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to let them fail. The problem with toxic families is that they never notice boundaries until they slam directly into them. My father had spent most of his life walking into my home without knocking. Jason borrowed money without asking. Melissa treated every personal detail I shared like community property. And for years I let it happen because saying no in the Carter family came with consequences. Silence, shame, withdrawal, punishment disguised as disappointment. But standing in my kitchen that morning, watching the 3 of them outside my security gate through a high-definition monitor, I realized something almost absurd. They still thought they were dealing with the old version of me, the one desperate to stay welcome. Dad pressed the call button again. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I poured coffee into a ceramic army mug and watched them for another full minute. Jason paced beside the driveway with restless energy running his hands through thinning hair. Melissa stood perfectly still, expensive purse hanging from one shoulder, the performance of dignity already prepared for whoever opened the door. Dad looked furious. Good. I finally pressed the intercom button. What do you want? Dad's voice came sharp through the speaker. Open the gate! No. Jason threw his hands into the air immediately. Jesus Christ, Evelyn. What do you want? I repeated. Dad stepped closer to the camera. We're handling this face to face. No, you're handling this from outside my property. Even through the monitor, I saw the shock hit him. Not because I refused. Because I enforced it. My father belonged to a generation of men who believed authority naturally transferred through blood. To him, being my father meant permanent access, permanent influence, permanent ownership over the emotional geography of my life. And suddenly the gate between us wasn't just metal. It was unfamiliar, threatening, real. Jason muttered something angrily before Dad snapped at him to shut up. Then my father lowered his voice into what used to pass for reason. You're overreacting. I leaned against the kitchen counter. You tried to tie me financially to $330,000 in debt. It wasn't like that. Then explain it. Silence. That told me everything. Melissa finally stepped forward. Evelyn, we all said things emotionally at dinner. No, I said calmly. You all revealed things honestly. Her expression tightened. Dad exhaled heavily into the speaker. Enough drama. Open the damn gate. Number. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Dad delivered the line he'd probably expected to work his entire life. After everything we've done for you. I actually laughed. Not loudly. Just once. Because nothing exposes manipulation faster than vague accounting. What exactly did you do for me? I asked quietly. Dad's jaw flexed. Jason looked away. And suddenly memories started surfacing so vividly I could almost smell them again. 16 years old. Washing dishes while Jason celebrated his acceptance to college with a backyard party Dad paid for entirely. 19 years old, standing in army fatigues at my enlistment ceremony while Dad spent most of the afternoon complaining Jason's truck needed new tires. 24 years old, wiring money home from Kuwait because Jason fell behind on mortgage payments. 36 years old, sitting beside Mom's hospital bed alone while Jason missed chemotherapy appointments because he couldn't handle hospitals. Every sacrifice had flowed one direction. Toward him. Never toward me. I pressed the gate release button not to let them in but to open the outer pedestrian entrance. If you want to talk, I said, you can walk to the front door. Dad looked offended by the inconvenience itself. Good again. 3 minutes later, I opened the front door before they could knock. Dad immediately stepped forward like he intended to enter. I blocked the doorway. His eyes narrowed. Move. No? You're seriously not letting your own father inside. Not today. Jason gave a bitter laugh. Look at this place. I knew what he saw. Vaulted ceilings, hardwood floors, clean furniture, stability. Everything he once mocked me for building carefully instead of recklessly. Melissa folded her arms. You've changed. No, I answered. I stopped apologizing for seeing clearly. Dad's patience finally cracked. Bank says everything's frozen, he snapped. Restore the access. There it was. Not concern. Not reconciliation. Business. I met his stare evenly. No. Jason stepped forward, now anger leaking through his composure. You think you're teaching me some lesson? No, I think consequences are. You self-righteous. Jason Melissa warned softly. But he was unraveling too quickly now. Dad pointed toward me. You're destroying this family over money. I almost answered immediately. Then I realized something important. This was never about money either. It was about obedience. The money was simply the leash. I'm not destroying anything, I said quietly. I'm refusing to finance it. Dad's face darkened. Your mother would be ashamed. That one landed harder than the others. Not because I believed him. Because he knew exactly where to aim. For a second, grief moved through me sharp enough to feel physical. Mom standing in the kitchen humming softly. Mom smoothing tension over dinner tables with exhausted smiles. Mom telling me privately, you don't always have to carry everyone's sweetheart. Dad saw the hesitation. Predators always recognize weakness fastest. You think the army made you strong, he continued. It made you cold. I looked at him steadily. No, I said. Being raised here did that. Jason scoffed loudly. Unbelievable. Then something occurred to me. A detail that hadn't fit since dinner. I turned toward him. How much was gambling? Everything stopped. Melissa's face drained instantly. Dad looked away too quickly. And Jason's silence answered before his mouth ever could. Not failed investments. Not bad luck. Gambling. The realization settled through me with strange calm. How long, I asked. Jason exploded instead. Don't look at me like that. How long? Couple years. Melissa whispered 4. Dad rounded on her. Melissa. No, she snapped, suddenly tears rising for real this time. I'm tired of protecting him. Jason turned red instantly. Shut up. You mortgaged the house twice. Dad barked enough. But the truth had finally cracked open too far to contain. Private lenders. Sports betting. Refinanced debt. Missed payments. Threats. And through all of it, my father apparently kept believing the solution was me. Not accountability. Not treatment. Me. I stared at Jason carefully. You were willing to drag me into this. His eyes flashed defensively. You have the money. That's your justification. You're single Evelyn, no kids, no real responsibilities. I actually flinched. Not because it hurt. Because it revealed him completely. To Jason, my life only mattered if someone else depended on it. My discipline, my sacrifices, my decades of work meant nothing because I hadn't spent them rescuing him. Dad stepped forward again. He's your brother. And before I could stop myself, the words came out cold and clean. No, I said. He's your favorite mistake. Jason lunged. Not fully, not intelligently. But enough. His shoulder slammed into a small table near the entryway, knocking over a ceramic planter that shattered across the hardwood floor. Immediately, the security alarm triggered. A sharp, automated voice filled the house. Emergency response activated. Jason froze. Dad looked stunned. You called the police. I folded my arms calmly. No, I answered. My house did. Somewhere in the distance, faint, but growing louder, sirens began moving through the quiet Virginia morning. And for the first time in his life, my father looked uncertain about whether he still had control over what happened next. The sirens grew louder until blue lights flickered across the trees lining my driveway. For one strange second, nobody moved. Jason stood near the shattered planter, breathing hard chest, rising unevenly beneath his wrinkled polo shirt. Melissa looked horrified not by what he'd done, but by the fact that someone outside the family might finally witness it. And my father looked insulted. As if accountability itself were disrespectful. 2 Fairfax County officers stepped onto the porch moments later, calm and professional in the way experienced officers usually are when walking into domestic disputes. One was younger, maybe early 30s. The other carried the tired eyes of a man who'd spent decades watching families destroy each other over pride. The older officer glanced briefly at the broken ceramic pieces scattered across my entryway. Morning, he said evenly. We received an automatic disturbance alert. Dad immediately straightened his posture and pointed toward me. This is a misunderstanding. Family disagreement. The younger officer looked at me. Ma'am, are you the homeowner? Before I answered, Dad spoke again. I'm her father. The older officer didn't even blink. I asked her, sir. Something almost invisible shifted across Dad's face then. A tiny fracture in the authority he assumed every room automatically granted him. I stepped forward calmly. Yes, I own the property. The officer nodded. Do you want them removed? The silence that followed felt enormous. Because despite everything, part of me still hesitated. Not from fear. From grief. There's a particular kind of heartbreak that comes when you realize the people who raised you only feel close to you when they're controlling you. Even standing there with shattered ceramic at my feet and decades of manipulation sitting heavy in my chest, some younger version of me still wanted my father to suddenly become reasonable. To apologize. To choose me for once. But old fantasies are dangerous things. They keep people standing in burning buildings hoping the fire will turn into warmth. Yes, I said quietly, I want them to leave. Jason stared at me like I'd slapped him. Melissa looked down immediately. Dad's expression hardened into something cold enough to remind me exactly who he'd always been. You'd throw your own family out with police standing here. I held his gaze. You already threw me out, I answered. The younger officer motioned gently toward the driveway. Sir, ma'am, let's head outside. Jason muttered curses under his breath as he walked past me. Melissa followed silently, heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Dad lingered one extra second in the doorway. "You think this makes you powerful?" he asked quietly. "No," I said. "I think it makes me safe." For the first time, he had no response. After they left, the house became painfully quiet. I locked the front door and leaned against it for several seconds, staring at the broken planter on the floor. Soil had spilled across the hardwood in dark streaks, tiny green leaves crushed beneath Jason's shoes. Damage always looked smaller after the noise stopped. I cleaned slowly. Not because the mess required that much time, but because I needed movement to settle my thoughts. The repetitive motion helped. Dustpan, vacuum, damp cloth. Contain the damage. Restore order. The military teaches you that too. By noon, rain had started again, soft at first, then heavier against the windows. I carried my mother's letter into the living room and read it twice more while thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. Love should never send invoices. I kept hearing that line. Not dramatically, just steadily. Like truth usually arrives. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Dad. I ignored it. Then another call. And another. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. I almost deleted it automatically. Instead, I listened. His voice sounded different now, less furious, more tired. "Jason's lenders are escalating things," he said. "People are calling the house. Melissa took the kids to her sister's. He's falling apart, Evelyn." I stared out at the rain-soaked woods behind my house. Part of me hated hearing that. Not because I wanted to rescue him. Because despite everything, I remembered the version of Jason who once taught me to ride a bicycle in an empty church parking lot. The teenager who slipped me candy after Dad grounded me. The brother who existed before entitlement calcified into dependency. Families aren't painful because they're entirely evil. They're painful because love exists there too. Just unevenly. Dad continued speaking through the voicemail. "I know we handled things wrong." Handled things? As though extortion were a scheduling conflict. "But he's still your brother." I stopped the message before it finished. An hour later, Daniel called. "We've got another issue." I closed my eyes briefly. "Tell me." One of Jason's creditors attempted to initiate inquiry access through the old trust linkage this morning. Ice spread slowly through my chest. "Did they get anything?" "No, we blocked it in time." "In time." The phrase echoed uncomfortably. Not theoretically. Someone had already tried. I sat down heavily at the kitchen island, so they knew about me. "Yes." "How?" Daniel hesitated. "I suspect Jason disclosed your financial standing during negotiations." For several seconds I said nothing. Outside, thunder cracked sharply enough to rattle the windows. My own brother had effectively handed my name to desperate lenders because he believed my money was eventually reachable. I felt strangely calm after that. Betrayal eventually reaches a saturation point where additional damage stops surprising you. "What's next?" I asked. Daniel's voice became crisp again. "We finish isolating everything. I also strongly recommend reducing your visibility for a while." "You think they'll come after me personally?" "I think desperate people make desperate calculations." That evening I made another decision. I called the Pentagon Liaison Office and accepted a strategic advisory assignment in Germany that I'd postponed twice already. 12-month posting. Possibly longer. The woman on the line sounded surprised. "I thought you declined." I changed my mind. After hanging up, I walked through my house slowly. The framed photographs. The leather chair near the fireplace. The quiet kitchen I'd rebuilt after my divorce. I loved this house. Which was exactly why I suddenly understood I couldn't stay. Not because I was afraid. Because the people outside those gates no longer saw this place as my home. They saw it as an asset. Leverage. A vault they believed existed for family use. That realization changed something fundamental. Near midnight, I opened a bottle of wine and sat alone on the back patio beneath the covered awning while rain fell softly through the trees. For the first time in years, nobody was asking me for anything. No money. No emotional labor. No rescue. The silence felt unfamiliar. Then strangely beautiful. My phone buzzed once more against the table. A text from Melissa. "You don't understand how bad this really is." A second message followed almost immediately. He owes people you don't ignore. I stared at the words for a long moment. Then I locked the phone and listened to the rain instead. Because somewhere between the barbecue and the police lights and the shattered planter on my floor, I had finally understood something my mother tried to teach me years ago. You cannot save people who keep feeding the fire they're standing in. And if you stay too close long enough, eventually they'll burn you too. 5 days after my father told me I was no longer family, the moving truck arrived at sunrise. By then, most of the house already stood half empty. The framed photographs were packed away. The bookshelves sat stripped bare except for dust outlines where years of my life used to rest. Even the kitchen felt unfamiliar without the copper pans hanging above the island. Funny how quickly a home starts looking temporary once your peace inside it is broken. 2 movers carried the last sealed boxes down the hallway, while I stood near the front windows holding a cup of coffee gone cold in my hands. Outside, early morning fog drifted low through the trees surrounding the property, pale and quiet beneath the Virginia dawn. Germany. 20 hours from now, I'd be there. A year ago, the idea would have frightened me. Starting over overseas at 48, leaving behind the routines I'd built so carefully after my divorce. Walking away from the first place that had ever truly felt like mine. But now it felt clean. Necessary. Like finally setting down weight you forgot you were carrying. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:14 a.m. Not one ring. 3 sharp, impatient presses. I already knew who it was before checking the monitor. Dad stood on the porch in the same brown jacket he wore every winter, no matter the weather. Jason looked exhausted beside him, eyes bloodshot, beard uneven like he hadn't slept properly in days. Melissa stood farther back, holding herself stiffly together, one hand wrapped around her purse strap. And behind them stood 2 of my cousins from North Carolina. Backup. Pressure. Witnesses. Family politics always become more theatrical once money enters the room. One of the movers glanced toward me awkwardly. "You want us to pause?" "No," I said calmly. "Keep going." Then I opened the door. Cold morning air spilled inside. Dad immediately looked past me into the nearly empty living room. His face changed instantly. "What is this?" "I'm moving." Jason frowned hard. "Moving where?" "Germany." Silence hit the porch like impact. Melissa's eyes widened first, Dad second, Jason last. "You're joking," Jason said. "No. You can't just leave." I almost smiled at that. The same people who spent years treating me like an emergency fund suddenly sounded abandoned the moment I stopped standing still. Dad stepped closer. "You sold the house." "Yes." "You sold this house without telling us." I stared at him carefully. There was something almost tragic about how sincerely shocked he sounded. As if I still required permission to control my own life, as opposed to attaching me to hundreds of thousands in debt without telling me. His jaw tightened. Jason ran both hands through his hair aggressively. "Jesus Christ, Evelyn, this is insane." "No," I answered quietly, "this is organized." One of the movers passed behind me carrying a floor lamp toward the truck. Dad watched silently for several seconds before lowering his voice. "We need to talk privately. There's nothing left to discuss." "There absolutely is." His composure finally cracked slightly. "Jason's situation is getting worse." Melissa looked down immediately. I noticed then how exhausted she truly seemed. The expensive clothes couldn't hide it anymore, neither could the makeup. She looked like someone who'd spent years trying to hold water inside collapsing walls. Jason pointed toward me. "You froze everything." "Yes." "You destroyed every option I had." "No," I said. "I removed myself from the consequences of your decisions." His face reddened instantly. "You think you're better than everybody." The old accusation. The Carter family's favorite weapon whenever accountability appeared. I shook my head slowly. "No, I think I'm tired." That answer landed differently. Because it was true. I wasn't standing there triumphant. I wasn't hungry for revenge. I wasn't secretly enjoying Jason's collapse or my father's panic. I was exhausted. Exhausted from decades of emotional debt collection disguised as loyalty. Dad took one slow breath, recalibrating his tone again. "Look," he said quietly, "maybe mistakes were made." "Mistakes? Such a gentle word for betrayal. But this family needs you." There it was again. Needs. Not loves. Not respects. Needs. I looked at him standing there on my porch at 75 years old, shoulders slightly curved with age pride, fighting desperation in real time across his face. And suddenly I saw him differently. Not as a villain. As a man terrified of watching the system he built finally collapse. Jason had always been the son who received protection. I had always been the daughter expected to absorb pressure. If I left, my father would finally face the truth he'd avoided for decades. Jason could not be carried forever. You should have taught him how to survive, I said softly. Instead, you taught him someone would always save him. Dad's expression darkened immediately. He's your brother. And I was your daughter. The words hung there quietly. Heavy enough that even Jason stopped talking. One of my cousins shifted uncomfortably near the porch steps, clearly regretting involvement already. Melissa finally spoke, voice fragile. They're talking about foreclosure. I met her eyes. And tears filled hers suddenly. You really don't care? That question hurt more than I expected. Because caring had never actually been my problem. I cared too much for too long. I cared through ignored birthdays and one-sided holidays and financial rescues nobody appreciated once the crisis passed. I cared until caring became permission. Yes, I answered honestly. I care. That's why I finally stopped helping. Nobody spoke after that. Wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the property. Somewhere down the road a dog barked. The moving truck engine rumbled low in the background like distant thunder. Jason looked at the empty house behind me again. Then something inside him finally snapped. You ruined my life, he hissed. And for the first time since all this started, I saw him clearly enough to feel something close to peace. Not because he was broken. Because he still genuinely believed someone else had caused the consequences of his own choices. No, Jason, I said quietly. You bet it away. He looked like he wanted to argue. But there was nothing left to argue with. The truth had finally become too visible. Melissa touched his arm gently. Come on. He jerked away at first. Then finally let her guide him back toward the driveway. Dad didn't move. He stood there staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before in my entire life. Not anger. Not authority. Loss. Please, he said softly, don't go. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Because some part of me had waited my entire life to hear him say that. To ask me to stay. To choose me. But timing matters in life. And love that arrives only when usefulness disappears rarely feels like love at all. I stepped closer to the doorway. I left years ago, I told him gently. You just finally noticed. His eyes filled slightly then, though I don't think he realized it himself. For one impossible second, I almost hugged him. Then I remembered my mother sitting alone through chemo appointments, while Jason disappeared into another business meeting. I remembered Dad demanding money instead of asking if I was happy. I remembered the dinner table. Refuse and you're no longer family. And just like that, the moment passed. Dad lowered his eyes first, then slowly turned away. I watched all of them walk down the driveway together beneath the pale morning fog until they disappeared beyond the gate. Only then did I close the door. The house echoed now when I walked through it. Empty. Quiet. Free. An hour later, the movers finished loading the final boxes. I picked up my carry-on suitcase, locked the front door one last time, and walked toward the waiting car as sunrise broke gold through the trees. For 30 years, my family called obedience love. The day I finally said no, I learned the difference. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, I hope you remember this. Sometimes walking away isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's survival. If this story touched something in you, share your thoughts below. I'd truly like to know where you're watching from and whether you've ever had to set boundaries with people you loved. And if you enjoy stories about strength, family, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next journey.